Every year, a small number of teenagers walk through the gates of a handful of schools that most of the world has never heard of. Not the ones with the biggest Instagram followings. Not the ones that top the national rankings you see in magazines. The quiet ones. The ones named after Episcopal saints and colonial governors, tucked behind stone walls in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Surrey, and the Swiss Alps. These teenagers will not necessarily leave with better grades than the kid down the road at the local public school. Some of them will leave with worse ones, but they will leave with something that no transcript can capture: a fully assembled adult network, decades before they need it. This is the part of old money that almost never gets discussed honestly. Everyone wants to talk about the trust funds, the offshore structures, the art collections sitting in free ports, untaxed and unseen. But the real machinery of generational wealth doesn't start with a lawyer or an accountant. It starts with a school application, a summer internship arranged over a phone call nobody records, and a mentor who was chosen the way you'd choose a business partner, carefully and years in advance. This isn't hidden. It's just never taught. And today, we're going to walk through exactly how it works. Part 1. Education as a transmission system, not a credential. To understand how old money approaches education, you have to first throw out the assumption most of us grow up with: the idea that education exists primarily to produce knowledge or certify competence. For a family managing wealth across generations, education serves a different, more specific function. It is the primary mechanism by which cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital get transferred from one generation to the next, in a form the next generation can actually use. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu spent much of his career mapping this out, and his framework remains the single best lens for understanding what's actually happening inside an elite education. Bourdieu identified 3 forms of capital that function alongside money: cultural capital, the tastes, manners, vocabulary, and reference points that mark someone as belonging to a particular class; social capital, the network of relationships a person can call on; and symbolic capital, prestige and legitimacy, the kind that makes people defer to you without needing to ask why. A public school education, even an excellent one, is optimized to deliver academic capital: test scores, subject mastery, credentials. An old money education is optimized to deliver all 4 forms of capital simultaneously, with academic capital often treated as the least important of the 4. This is precisely why families with the resources to send a child anywhere will sometimes choose a school with a less impressive academic reputation over a more rigorous one. Because the second school delivers a stronger network, a more useful set of manners, and a more valuable brand name to carry for the rest of that person's life. This is not a value judgment. It is simply how the system is designed to function, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it in the transcripts of history's wealthiest families. If frameworks like this are the kind of thing that makes sense of what you've been noticing but couldn't name, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Hit subscribe now, because the next section breaks down exactly how the school selection process works, and it is far more calculated than most people realize. Part 2. The school selection calculus. When an old money family evaluates a school, they are running a multivariable calculation that has almost nothing to do with the criteria most parents use. Here is what actually gets weighed: feeder patterns. The single most important variable is where a school's graduates historically go next, not in a general sense, but in a documented, almost statistical sense. Certain boarding schools have maintained multi-generational feeder relationships with specific universities for over a century. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't purely about academic preparation. Admissions officers at elite universities know these schools, trust their grading standards, have decades of data on how their graduates perform, and in many cases have alumni networks that overlap directly with the school's own board of trustees. A family choosing a boarding school is choosing a pipeline, not just a curriculum. Peer composition. Old money families are, bluntly, evaluating who their child's classmates' families are. A school's real product, from this angle, is the 60 other 15-year-olds in the freshman class and the parents attached to them. Those relationships, formed in dining halls, on athletic fields, in dormitories at 17 years old, tend to calcify into lifelong professional and social networks, precisely because they formed before anyone involved had anything to gain from each other. That's the mechanism. A friendship built at 14, before either party has money, a title, or a company, reads as authentic in a way that a friendship built at a networking event at 35 never quite does. Old money understands that the earlier a relationship starts, the more durable and more useful it becomes. Faculty to alumni continuity. Elite boarding schools are often run, taught in, and governed by their own alumni. A family looking at a school will look closely at how many faculty, headmasters, and trustees are themselves graduates. This tells them something important, that the institution's culture is self-perpetuating, stable across decades, and unlikely to drift from the values the family is trying to instill. A school where the culture resets every 5 years with new administration is, from this perspective, a liability, physical and reputational permanence. Old money families gravitate toward institutions with long, unbroken histories. Schools founded in the 1700s and 1800s that have survived wars, market crashes, and changing educational fashions without rebranding themselves. The reasoning is straightforward. A name that has carried weight for 200 years is a more stable asset to attach a child's identity to than a name that's currently trending. Prestige that took 2 centuries to build is much harder to counterfeit and much harder to lose. Selectivity as filtration, not as prize. It's worth being precise here. The extreme selectivity of these institutions isn't valued because rejection is exciting. It's valued because rigorous filtration on the front end guarantees the quality of the peer network on the back end. If a school accepts a very small percentage of a very well-resourced applicant pool, every family inside the building has already been vetted for financial standing, for family reputation, and often for the family's own network of sponsoring relationships to the school, previous alumni, existing donor relationships, or trustee connections. The child, in other words, is stepping into a room that has already been pre-screened on their behalf. There is a term worth introducing here because you will hear it again throughout this series. Legacy infrastructure. It refers to any institution, a school, a club, a university, a firm, where multi-generational family involvement is not just tolerated, but structurally rewarded through legacy admissions preferences, alumni-weighted donor recognition, or board seats that pass informally within families. Old money doesn't just attend legacy institutions. They build and sustain them, generation after generation, specifically because the infrastructure compounds in value the longer a family stays embedded in it. This is also why you'll notice old money families rarely chase the best school in a purely academic sense if it lacks this deeper infrastructure. A newer institution, however academically rigorous, hasn't had 200 years to accumulate trustees who sit on Fortune 500 boards, alumni who run merchant banks, or a physical campus that signals permanence rather than ambition. Prestige, in this world, behaves less like a marketing campaign and more like a slow compounding asset. And old money invests in it the same way they invest in everything else, for the long term, with patience, and with an eye toward what the asset will be worth to the next generation, not just this one. Part 3. The Mentor System. B-roll, a young person shadowing an older executive in an office, a handshake across a boardroom table, a yacht club burgee, an old photograph of a family business meeting. If schools build the network's foundation, mentors are the mechanism by which that network gets activated and put to use. And in old money families, mentorship is rarely left to chance. It is often as deliberately architected as the schooling itself. There tends to be a clear distinction between two categories of mentor, and understanding both is essential to understanding how the system functions. The formal mentor is usually someone embedded in the family's own institutional apparatus, a longtime family attorney, the chairman of the family office, a senior partner at the firm the family has banked with for generations, or an elder relative who has taken on a specific advisory role. This mentor's job is explicit: teach the next generation how the family's actual mechanics work, how the trusts are structured, how the board of the family foundation operates, how to read a term sheet, sit through a difficult negotiation, or handle a journalist. This is, in effect, an apprenticeship in wealth stewardship, and it typically begins far earlier than most people would expect, often in the teenage years, through summer placements at the family's own businesses, attendance as a silent observer at board meetings, or structured shadow internships at institutions the family already has ties to. The informal mentor is a different animal entirely, and arguably more important. This is a senior figure, often outside the family, who is cultivated as a relationship over years, sometimes decades, well before any specific need for their help arises. A young heir might be introduced to a mentor through a school connection, a club membership, or a family friendship, and the relationship is nurtured slowly. Dinners, invitations to sit in on meetings, unpaid summer work at a firm the mentor leads. The value of this relationship isn't captured in a resume line. It's captured the moment that young person needs a reference nobody can buy, a warning about a bad deal before it becomes public, or a quiet introduction to someone 3 tiers up, a hierarchy that would otherwise take 15 years to reach on merit alone. The economic sociologist Mark Granovetter did some of the most important academic work explaining why these relationships matter so much in a 1973 paper that has become one of the most cited pieces of sociology in existence: The Strength of Weak Ties. Granovetter's central finding, later expanded across decades of research, was counterintuitive at the time: that the most valuable information and opportunities in a person's life tend to come not from their closest relationships, but from more distant acquaintances who move in different circles. Your close friends already know what you know. Your weak ties are bridges into rooms you've never been in. Old money mentorship networks are, functionally, an engineered abundance of high-value weak ties. A young heir moving through boarding school, then university, then a summer internship secured through a family friend, accumulates dozens of these weak tie relationships by their mid-20s, each one a potential bridge into a different industry, city, or opportunity. This is precisely why old money families invest so heavily in things that look, from the outside, like leisure, yacht clubs, hunting weekends, charity galas, alumni dinners. These aren't purely social activities. They are the maintenance infrastructure for a decades-long, weak-tie network. This is exactly the kind of mechanism-first thinking this channel is built around. Not aesthetics, not vibes, but how the system actually works underneath the surface. If you want the rest of this breakdown, including how families structure marriages and clubs as network consolidation tools, stay with us. And if you haven't already, now's a good time to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we go deep on one mechanism like this every single week. Part 4. Network Architecture, Clubs, Debutante Systems, and Marriage as Consolidation. Once a family has secured the school pipeline and cultivated formal and informal mentors, the next layer of the system is what we'll call network architecture, the deliberate infrastructure old money families build and maintain to keep their networks dense, current, and self-reinforcing across generations. Private clubs. The membership club, the yacht club, the country club, the men's or women's social club in a major city is one of the oldest and most misunderstood tools in this system. Outsiders tend to see these clubs as symbols of exclusivity for its own sake, or nostalgia for a bygone social order. Functionally, they serve a much more specific purpose. They are recurring, low-friction venues where multi-generational relationships get maintained without anyone having to schedule a meeting. A grandfather's relationship with another family, formed at a club 50 years ago, gets passed down almost automatically because the grandchildren of both families are now members of the same club, attending the same events, without ever having to consciously network. The club does the maintenance work that would otherwise require enormous, deliberate effort. Membership at these clubs is also, notably, one of the harder assets to purchase outright. Many require sponsorship from existing members, sometimes multiple sponsors, sometimes a waiting period measured in years. This isn't inefficiency. It's the same filtration logic as elite school admissions applied to adult social life. The barrier to entry protects the value of what's inside. The debutante and coming-of-age system. Historically, and in some circles still today, the formal debutante presentation served a very direct function beyond its ceremonial appearance. It was a structured, publicly legible way of signaling that a young woman, and in parallel systems, a young man's own analogous rites of passage, had reached marriageable age and was formally part of the family's social network, ready to be introduced to other families' networks. Stripped of the ball gowns and the choreography, it was, and in the families that maintain the tradition, still is, a network introduction ceremony, timed deliberately and executed with the same intentionality as a product launch. Marriage as network consolidation. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, and it's worth being direct about it rather than dancing around it. Among established wealth dynasties, marriage has historically functioned, and in meaningful ways continues to function, as one of the most powerful network consolidation tools available. When two families with established capital, established networks, and established institutional relationships intermarry, the result isn't just a merged household, it's a merged network. Two sets of school ties, two sets of club memberships, two sets of board relationships, and often two family offices worth of financial infrastructure, all becoming accessible to the next generation simultaneously. This is why, historically, elite families have paid such close attention to who their children spend time with in exactly the settings we've already described: the boarding schools, the clubs, the debutante circuits. These aren't separate systems. They're stages of the same pipeline, and marriage is frequently one of its outputs, whether or not any individual family ever states that intention explicitly. It's also worth noting, for accuracy, that this dynamic has weakened considerably over the past century as social mobility, women's independent wealth holding, and shifting cultural norms have made marriage a far less centrally engineered institution than it was in, say, the Gilded Age. But the underlying logic, that marriage can function as a network merger, hasn't disappeared. It's simply become less formal and less openly discussed. Gender-differentiated tracks within the same system. It's worth being precise about something that often gets flattened in popular discussion of old money education. Historically, and to a diminishing but still measurable extent today, the system described above operated through two parallel tracks rather than one identical curriculum. Sons were more often funneled toward the formal mentorship apparatus described in Part 3, direct exposure to the family business, board observation, apprenticeship at allied firms, on the assumption they would eventually hold formal operating or governance control. Daughters, particularly before the mid-20th century, were more often funneled toward the network and social capital track, the debutante system, philanthropic committee placements, and the etiquette and comportment curriculum described in Part 5, on the assumption their primary contribution to the family's multi-generational position would run through marriage and social network stewardship, rather than direct operational control. This division has narrowed substantially since the mid-20th century, as women gained greater direct access to formal mentorship, business apprenticeship, and independent wealth holding, and in many contemporary old money families, daughters now move through the same formal mentor pipeline as sons, sometimes explicitly groomed for family, office leadership, or foundation chairmanship. But the historical asymmetry matters for understanding the system's origins because it explains why the soft elements of old money education, etiquette, philanthropy placement, the debutante circuit, were never actually soft in function. They were, for a large portion of history, the primary operating track through which half of every dynasty's heirs were expected to preserve and extend the family's position. Treating them as decorative rather than functional badly misreads how much of the system's actual network-building work happened through exactly these channels. The sociological term for what all of this produces across schools, clubs, mentorship, and marriage combined is social closure, a concept developed by the sociologist Max Weber and later expanded by others, referring to the process by which social groups maintain their advantages by restricting access to outsiders. Old money's education system isn't really about educating in the traditional sense. It's a decades-long exercise in social closure, executed patiently enough that it rarely looks deliberate from the outside. Which is, of course, exactly the point. Part 5. The Hidden Curriculum. What elite education actually teaches. Beyond the institutional mechanics of school and mentorship sits something even less discussed: the actual content of what gets taught, informally, alongside the official curriculum. This is what sociologists sometimes call the hidden curriculum, the unwritten lessons an institution transmits through its culture and structure, rather than its textbooks. Etiquette and comportment. Formal etiquette, the specific fork, the correct way to address a letter, how to enter a room, how to end a conversation gracefully, is often dismissed by outsiders as archaic decoration. Functionally, it operates as a real-time credentialing system. In a room full of strangers, Someone who moves through a formal dinner without hesitation is silently signaling, within the first 90 seconds, that they belong to a particular social class, without a single word being exchanged about money, background, or credentials. This is Bourdieu's cultural capital in its purest, most observable form, a set of embodied habits, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that they read as instinct rather than training. Multilingualism. Elite old money education has, for centuries, prioritized fluency in multiple languages, historically French as the language of diplomacy and high society, alongside whichever languages mattered for a given family's specific business or geographic interests. This wasn't cultural enrichment for its own sake. A family with financial and social interests spanning London, Geneva, and New York needed heirs who could operate fluently in each city's language and social register without an interpreter, without hesitation, and without ever appearing to be a foreigner in rooms where that mattered. Sports as capital. The specific sports old money families cultivate in their children, sailing, equestrian sports, fencing, rowing, golf, tennis, polo, are rarely chosen for physical fitness alone. Each of these sports has its own institutional infrastructure, clubs, competitions, associations, that doubles as a parallel network to the school system, and each requires access to expensive, exclusive facilities that function as another filtration layer. A young person who rows competitively, for instance, is spending years inside a boathouse culture that connects, almost inevitably, to a specific set of prep schools, university programs, and alumni networks, the same legacy infrastructure we discussed earlier, just with an oar in hand instead of a diploma. Philanthropy training. Perhaps the least discussed element of the hidden curriculum is early exposure to structured philanthropy. Not casual charity, but formal training in how a family foundation operates, how a gift is structured for maximum institutional relationship value, and how board seats at cultural and charitable institutions function as another form of network access. Heirs are frequently brought onto junior committees of museums, hospitals, and foundations in their 20s, long before they have any independent wealth of their own to give. Because the relationship-building value of the seat has nothing to do with the size of the check. It's another mechanism for early, low-stakes access to rooms full of decision-makers who will matter for the rest of that person's career. Early exposure to risk, negotiation, and loss. One element of the hidden curriculum that rarely gets discussed is deliberate, controlled exposure to financial risk and negotiation at a small scale, long before an heir has any meaningful capital of their own to lose. This might take the form of a modest personal investment account managed under supervision from adolescence. A small allocation an heir is permitted to allocate and lose within a family investment vehicle, or direct inclusion in negotiations over comparatively minor family assets, a property sale, an art acquisition, a small business decision. Specifically so, the emotional experience of negotiating, winning, and losing happens under supervision and at limited stakes. The logic mirrors flight simulator training. By the time an heir is negotiating something that actually matters, the unfamiliar part isn't the emotional experience of high-stakes negotiation itself. It's simply the scale of the numbers involved. Families that skip this step tend to produce heirs who are financially literate in the abstract but untested in practice. A gap that often only becomes visible at the worst possible moment, when a genuinely consequential decision arrives with no rehearsal behind it. Cultivated taste as a filtration signal. A closely related and often underestimated element of the hidden curriculum is deliberate cultivation of taste in art, architecture, wine, and design, not as a hobby, but as another real-time credentialing mechanism functioning alongside etiquette. The ability to discuss a painting's provenance intelligently, to recognize a piece of furniture's period and maker, or to navigate a wine list without hesitation operates the same way correct table manners do, as an instantly legible signal of belonging, absorbed through years of exposure to family collections, museum trusteeships, and curated travel, rather than through any single course of study. This is part of why old money families so often maintain private collections and support cultural institutions across generations. The collection itself is an asset, but the process of growing up around it and being taught to evaluate it critically is arguably the more valuable long-term output. Taken together, this hidden curriculum produces something that looks, on the surface, like personal refinement, but is functionally closer to a fully integrated operating system for moving through elite institutional life, one that most people, regardless of how wealthy they later become, never get the chance to fully install, because it has to be built in childhood and adolescence to feel natural in adulthood. This is one of the most durable advantages old money holds over new wealth. Money can be earned quickly, but this particular curriculum cannot be compressed. It requires the runway of an entire childhood. Before we get into how 3 of history's most consequential wealth dynasties actually applied, or failed to apply, everything we've just covered, drop a comment telling us which part of this system surprised you most. We read every one, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. And if this kind of forensic breakdown is what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because the case studies coming up are where all of this theory gets tested against real historical outcomes. Part 6. Case Studies. When the system works and when it fails. Theory is useful, but the real test of any system is what happens when you look at outcomes across multiple generations. Here, 3 historical dynasties illustrate the system at its most effective, and, in one case, its collapse. The Rockefeller model, deliberate, multi-generational infrastructure. The Rockefeller family, beginning with John D. Rockefeller in the late 19th century, is one of the clearest historical examples of a family that treated education and network building as core infrastructure rather than an afterthought to wealth. Subsequent generations of the family were systematically placed within elite educational institutions, and critically, the family didn't simply consume existing legacy infrastructure. They built their own, founding and funding institutions, including the University of Chicago and what would become Rockefeller University, creating exactly the kind of self-perpetuating institutional relationship we described earlier, where family involvement in governance continued across generations. Family members were also cultivated early for board and philanthropic roles, consistent with the philanthropy as network access pattern discussed above. The family's continued prominence across more than 5 generations, a rarity in wealth preservation, correlates directly with this sustained, deliberate investment in education and institutional network building, rather than wealth transfer alone. The Rothschild model, education as a distributed, multilingual, multi-city apparatus. The Rothschild banking dynasty, originating in late 18th century Frankfurt, built one of history's most explicit examples of education deployed specifically for network architecture. Meyer Amschel Rothschild's strategy of positioning his sons in different European financial capitals, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, Paris, and London, required an education system built specifically to produce heirs who were fluent across languages, cultures, and financial systems simultaneously, functioning as trusted, coordinated nodes of a single family enterprise spanning multiple countries. This is the multilingualism as capital principle in its most extreme historical form. The family's wealth depended directly on their heirs' capacity to operate seamlessly across borders that, at the time, most people never crossed in a lifetime. The Vanderbilt cautionary tale: capital without the transmission system. The Vanderbilt family offers the clearest counterexample in American history, and it's a pattern worth understanding carefully because it inverts everything discussed above. Cornelius Vanderbilt built one of the largest fortunes in American history through shipping and railroads, but by most historical accounts did not prioritize instilling in his heirs the same disciplined operational and financial education that had built the fortune in the first place, reportedly expressing skepticism about formal education's value, even as his own wealth scaled into the hundreds of millions. Subsequent generations, having inherited enormous capital without a comparably rigorous transmission system for financial discipline, institutional stewardship, or network building, spent lavishly on physical assets, enormous estates, uninsurable in scale, that stand today largely as museums rather than functioning family seats. Within a few generations, by most historical accounts, the family fortune had been substantially dispersed. It's worth being precise here, rather than reaching for a dramatic round number. The specific claim that not one Vanderbilt was a millionaire by a family reunion held decades later is a widely repeated statistic whose original sourcing is difficult to verify rigorously, and it should be treated as a popularized estimate rather than an audited fact. What is well documented, however, is the broader pattern of rapid capital dispersion relative to the fortune's original scale. And that pattern lines up precisely with the absence of the educational and network infrastructure the Rockefellers and Rothschilds built so deliberately. Two additional details from these case studies are worth pulling out because they map directly back onto the mechanisms covered earlier in this video. First, both the Rockefeller and Rothschild families combined formal mentorship with genuine early operational responsibility. Heirs weren't simply observers in board meetings, they were given real, if limited, decision-making authority at a young age. Precisely the controlled risk exposure pattern described in Part 5. Second, both families treated philanthropic and institutional involvement as inseparable from business education, rather than as a separate, softer pursuit. Rockefeller philanthropy and Rothschild involvement in European cultural and civic institutions function simultaneously as genuine charitable contribution and as the network and reputation building mechanism described in Part 5's discussion of philanthropy training. Neither family treated these as competing priorities. They treated them as the same activity, viewed from two angles. This is also a useful moment to flag something you'll hear repeated across wealth management literature. The claim that somewhere between 70 and 90% of family fortunes don't survive past the third generation. This statistic circulates constantly, but its methodology is genuinely contested among researchers. The studies behind it vary widely in how they define survival, what counts as a comparable fortune across generations, and how inflation and family splitting are accounted for. We'll do a full breakdown of where this number actually comes from in a future video. But even treating it cautiously, the qualitative pattern across documented case studies is consistent. Families that built durable, multi-generational education and network infrastructure, like the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, preserved both wealth and institutional relevance far longer than families that treated the fortune itself as the only asset worth protecting. Part 7. how this system has adapted to the modern era. It would be a mistake to treat any of this as purely historical. The mechanisms have adapted, but the underlying logic, education as a multi-capital transmission system, remains fully intact in how contemporary wealth dynasties operate. Legacy admissions remain a live mechanism. Despite growing public scrutiny and, in some jurisdictions, formal restrictions on legacy preferences at universities, the underlying feeder school to university pipeline described earlier continues to function largely intact because it doesn't depend on legacy admissions policy alone. It depends on the deeper relationships between specific schools and specific universities that have compounded over a century or more. Family offices now formally fund next-gen education programs. One of the more interesting modern developments is the degree to which family offices, the private wealth management entities that serve ultra-high net worth families, have institutionalized what used to happen informally through mentorship. Many family offices now run structured next-generation programs. Formal curricula covering financial literacy, governance, philanthropy, and family business operations, delivered to heirs starting in their teenage years. This is, in effect, the formal mentor system from Part 3, professionalized and systematized. Global mobility has replaced single-city network building. Where the Rothschilds once needed heirs fluent across a handful of European capitals, contemporary elite education increasingly emphasizes truly global fluency. International schools, multi-country boarding experiences, and university choices spread deliberately across continents, reflecting how thoroughly capital and the networks that manage it now move across borders. Digital era network maintenance. The private club function, low-friction, recurring relationship maintenance, has been partially supplemented, though not replaced, by more discrete digital and invitation-only professional networks, alongside a continued and, in some circles, intensified emphasis on in-person institutions, precisely because in-person, high-barrier-to-entry relationship maintenance remains harder to replicate at scale than a digital connection, and therefore retains more of its original filtration value. What hasn't changed across every adaptation is the core principle we opened with. Education, in old money families, is never solely about the individual being educated. It is infrastructure, built patiently, for the network that individual will need to steward and eventually pass down for decades to come. None of this is conspiracy. There's no secret handshake, no hidden document laying out the plan. It's simply a set of decisions made consistently and patiently across generations by families who understood, correctly, that money alone doesn't survive contact with time. The schools, the mentors, the clubs, the marriages, the philanthropy seats. All of it exists because wealth without the infrastructure to transmit it tends to dissolve quietly within a few generations, no matter how large it starts out. The families who last understood that the real curriculum was never really about grades. It was about building a network durable enough to outlive its founder and educating the next generation carefully enough to know exactly how to use it. If this kind of mechanism first breakdown is what you come to this channel for, this is genuinely the best time to subscribe. We're building out a full series on how old money systems actually function, and next week we're going inside the family constitution, the formal document that governs how many of these dynasties actually make decisions across generations. Drop a comment with a topic you want us to dig into next. And if you learned something today that you haven't seen explained clearly anywhere else, share this with one person who'd appreciate it too. We'll see you in the next one.